The night the fire came, nobody in the small frontier town of Red Hollow expected to see a man from the Apache plains standing in the middle of the street with his hands lifted as if daring the world to accuse him. Folks had spent years whispering stories about warriors from the desert hills, painting them as shadows that moved on horseback and vanished before dawn. Yet there he stood, tall and calm, wrapped in worn hide and beads that caught the firelight from the burning barn behind him. His face carried a rough strength, but his eyes held something deeper, something that did not match the tale of a raider or outlaw. They held truth. The kind that remained steady even when flames tried to swallow the night. She saw him before anyone else did. She had been helping old Mrs. Carter gather linens from behind the general store when the first crackle of fire snapped through the wind. Smoke rose fast, curling above the stables and turning the sky into a deep rust-like haze. People shouted. Horses cried in panic. Men grabbed rifles, not water buckets. Fear traveled faster than reason in those days. She felt her heart tighten as she watched the tall Apache stand alone before any blame was spoken aloud. She knew what was coming. She had seen the way talk twisted truth into something sharp enough to cut a man. Her life had not been filled with bravery. She lived quietly on the edge of town, sewing clothes for families who paid her in cornmeal or dried beans when money ran short. She kept to herself, trying to stay unnoticed in a place where one rumor could shape a person's future. Yet when she looked at the Apache standing silent against the rising flames, something stirred inside her, something she could not ignore. The town saw a threat. She saw a man trying to hold ground without lifting a weapon. The barn fire grew hotter. Sparks leaped onto nearby fences and wagon wheels. A group of ranch hands ran toward the flames carrying ropes and shovels, trying to break the spread. Others formed a half circle around the Apache, rifles half raised. The sheriff pushed through the crowd with a heavy step. He had a scar across his chin from an old cattle drive and a temper shaped by too many grudges. He had never been a man of patience. He stared at the Apache as if he had already decided. Everything without needing to ask a question. Someone muttered that the fire had to be an attack. Someone else swore they saw him near the fields earlier that day. The words piled up fast like dry brush ready to burn. She watched as neighbors she had known for years pushed closer with the same fearful anger that had ruined better men in other towns. She had heard tales of fires blamed on tribes long before anyone bothered to look for boot tracks or lantern oil. In the old American frontier, rumors had a way of shaping history even when truth stood in plain sight. A horse broke loose from the barn, smoke rolling off its back as it bolted down the street. The Apache stepped aside to let it pass while others jumped back in fear. Even in chaos, he moved with calm purpose. He looked toward the sheriff, not with challenge, but with a straight-backed honesty as if he had nothing to hide. It was then she noticed a long cut across his forearm, fresh and bleeding, not from battle but from trying to break the barn doors earlier when he heard the first shouts. She had seen enough wounds in her life to know the mark of someone trying to save life. Not take it, yet no one else seemed to notice. She could have stayed silent. It would have been easier to watch from behind the crowd and let whatever happened unfold. Folks in Red Hollow did not look kindly on anyone defending outsiders. Speaking up meant standing against the current, and the current that night was a wide and angry river. But something in her refused to let fear decide her voice. She stepped forward, clutching the linen she had been holding. Her hands shaking though her spine tried to stay firm, the sheriff asked the Apache why he was there. The man spoke in slow English, rough but clear enough for anyone listening with an open mind. He said he saw smoke while scouting for herbs in the hills and rode down to help. He said he tried to unbolt the barn doors, but the fire was already too strong. He said he stayed so no one would think he ran. His voice did not waver. He stood like a man who knew that leaving would only feed their doubts. But the sheriff tightened his jaw as if truth was an inconvenience. She stepped between them before the sheriff could speak. She said the cut on his arm came from the barn doors. She said she saw him pull the panicked horse free. She said he was not running from blame, he was standing in it, and the town did not have the right to pretend it knew more than he did. The crowd shifted. Some stared at her as though she had lost her sense. Others looked uncertain, caught between fear and reason. The fire began to dim as the barn collapsed inward, wood turning to ash. A deep silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling embers. Smoke drifted across the ground like low fog. The sheriff lowered his rifle but kept his gaze sharp. He told her she did not know who she was defending. He told her that trust was a dangerous thing in a land where peace never came easy. She replied that truth was a dangerous thing to ignore, especially when it stood right in front of them. The Apache looked at her then, really looked. His expression did not soften, but there was something in his eyes that shifted, something that resembled gratitude mixed with caution. He understood that her words might cost her more than they protected him. He carried the weight of someone used to standing alone, yet her presence beside him changed the shape of the moment. She did not know his story or where he came from, but she knew he deserved the chance to speak without a noose of rumor tightening around him. Before the sheriff could reply, a young ranch boy ran toward the crowd, yelling that he found something near the fence line, something made of metal buried in the dirt. He held up a broken lantern with a cracked glass chamber. Oil stains darkened the grass beside it. The crowd turned away from the Apache, drawn to the new piece of evidence. The sheriff walked over, eyes narrowing as he looked at the charred base. It was not the kind of lantern used by Apache riders. It looked like the ones used by ranch hands who worked night shifts watching cattle herds. Whispers spread. Slower this time, heavier. People started questioning whether the fire was caused by a careless hand from their own town, whether their anger had been pointed in the wrong direction. The sheriff did not speak. He stood still, holding the lantern in his hand like it weighed more than iron. She felt the tension twist into something new, something uncertain. The truth was rising through smoke, but truth often brought its own battles. She stood beside the Apache, close enough that she could feel the heat of the dying flames and hear the slow breath he took as if preparing for whatever came next. The night air cooled, but the real fire was just beginning. The sheriff turned back toward them with suspicion still lingering in his eyes. The crowd looked divided. The lantern had not cleared the Apache's name. It had only cracked the shell of assumption. What rose from those embers would decide whether the town listened to truth, or clung to fear even harder, and as she stood beside him, she knew that stepping forward had changed something deep inside her too. Something she could never return from. The real story had just begun. The smoke faded into the night sky, leaving only the low crackle of embers and the uneasy shift of boots on dirt. Folks drifted away in slow steps, glancing back at the Apache and the young woman beside him as if expecting trouble to break loose again. The sheriff ordered 2 ranch hands to watch the ruins until dawn, claiming he wanted to make sure no one tampered with what remained. But everyone knew he did not say that for the sake of truth. He said it to keep eyes trained on the Apache, to make certain no one forgot who had stood there when the fire began. She stayed silent while people left, holding the same linen bundle she had been clutching since the fire broke. Her heart still beat hard in her chest. She was not used to speaking in front of crowds, and her voice had quivered more than she wanted. Yet she could not regret stepping forward. Still, the sheriff's words lingered. This land had long fed its fears through gossip, and a single night could turn neighbors into judges faster than justice itself. She knew she had placed herself on a thin line, and the earth beneath her feet did not feel steady. The Apache finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. He thanked her for standing beside him, though he did not say the word thank in a soft way. It came out like something earned with weight. He told her he did not stay to be defended, only to make sure no false stories would rise with the flames. He had seen too many tales twisted by panic and too many lives ruined when the truth came second. She nodded, not sure how to answer a man who carried so much history in a single sentence. He turned to leave, moving toward the open field that stretched past the edge of town. His horse stood tied near a lone mesquite tree, ears flicking at the leftover smell of smoke. She hesitated before calling out, asking if he had a place to sleep. It was late, and the plains were cold this time of year. Wild animals hunted along the creek beds at night. He shook his head slowly, saying he traveled far and rested where sunrise found him. She wanted to ask what brought him near Red Hollow to begin with, but he mounted the horse with a smooth motion, as if he had lived in the saddle his whole life. He paused, looking back at her once, and then he rode into the moonlit dark without another word. She walked home alone. Her small cabin stood beyond the marsh road, just past the old church that leaned slightly to one side from storm damage years back. Lanterns flickered behind scattered windows. People were awake longer than usual, whispering inside. She knew they were talking about the fire, about the stranger, and about her stepping into a place no one expected her to stand. She kept her head down and tried not to think about how long it would take before rumors twisted her actions into something they were not. Inside her home, she lit a candle and washed soot from her hands. The room smelled of pine logs she kept stacked for nights like this. She stared at her reflection in the small tin mirror, noticing the faint smudge of ash across her cheek. She had always blended into the town, working at her sewing table by day, delivering mended clothes by evening. She never asked for trouble, never invited questions. Yet tonight she seemed like a different version of herself. More steady, more aware of the world beyond her doorstep. Sleep did not come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the barn collapsing and the Apache standing alone in the light of burning timber. She wondered how many times he had been judged without a voice. She wondered what stories people carried about him, stories that had nothing to do with truth. She drifted into uneasy rest only when dawn began to push across the horizon. By morning, the town looked almost unchanged, though something beneath the surface had shifted. She walked to the general store to deliver hemming work for Mrs. Carter, hoping the day might pass without whispers. But the moment she stepped onto the porch, two ranch wives stopped talking mid-sentence and watched her with curious eyes. One of them asked how she dared speak up last night. The other muttered that she needed to know who she stood with before choosing sides. Neither said it in a friendly tone. She smiled politely and moved on, not wanting to provoke anything more. With each step through the dusty street, she noticed more stares. Children gasped and hid behind barrels. Men nodded stiffly but did not speak. It felt as if the town had drawn a quiet line between her and them, though no one had the courage to say it aloud. She knew this might last only a few days or it might stretch into weeks. Words had long roots in the old American frontier. Once planted, they grew where no farmer would choose. At the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered. He stood outside holding the broken lantern that had been found near the fence. The townsfolk asked if it belonged to the Carter Ranch or maybe the Callahan herd watchers. The sheriff said he was not ready to point a finger, but his tone carried irritation. Someone asked whether he would still question the Apache. The sheriff answered yes. Not because there was proof, but because unanswered questions were dangerous. People nodded even though his reasoning held little shape. She stayed on the far side of the street, listening without stepping closer. She did not want to pull attention to herself again. But then the sheriff announced he would send word to nearby patrol riders to track the Apache and bring him back for questioning. Her chest tightened. Bringing him back under force could turn suspicion into something harsher. She did not know how the Apache would respond if cornered, not because he seemed violent, but because a man who lived by pride and truth might not accept chains easily. She returned to her cabin before anyone noticed her watching. She sat by the window and tried to focus on sewing, yet her hands trembled slightly. Threads slipped through her fingers. Her thoughts tangled like loose fabric. She wondered why she cared so much. It was not simply that she defended an innocent man. It felt deeper, as if she had been waiting her whole life for a moment that proved silence cost more than courage ever would. Later that afternoon, she walked toward the creek to fetch water. Wind moved through dry grass in long waves. Birds circled overhead, calling into the open plains. She knelt by the water's edge and dipped her bucket. When she stood, she saw hoofprints pressed into soft mud near the bank. They were fresh, heading toward a rocky path that led into the desert hills. She followed the trail a few steps, heart beating with curiosity. The Apache's horse tracks. It looked like he had camped there briefly. Ashes marked a small fire pit, not more than a hand's width across. She picked up a strand of horsehair caught on a branch. He had passed near her home before dawn. Perhaps he stayed close to watch whether the town turned against him again. Perhaps he waited for answers of his own. She returned home, clutching the bucket tighter than needed. She felt something pulling her, something that made her want to understand who he was beyond whispers. She did not seek danger, but she could not shake the sense that truth rested somewhere outside town lines, waiting to be uncovered. That night, voices rose again in the distance. She carried her lantern to the porch and saw a group of riders leaving the sheriff's office, heading toward the same trail she found earlier. The sheriff rode at the front, eyes set on the hills. They did not ride with weapons drawn, but their purpose was clear. They were going to find the Apache. She stepped back into the shadows, watching them disappear into the dark. The night air felt colder, heavier. She knew the sheriff would not show patience if the Apache refused to return quietly. And she knew the Apache would not bow for the sake of easing other men's fear. She closed her door, but not her worry. She felt caught between two worlds she never meant to walk. Truth had led her onto a path she could not see the end of, and every step ahead carried risk. The fire may have died, but something larger had been lit, and the flames were spreading. The riders did not return by dawn. The town woke uneasy, unsettled by the silence beyond the hills. No fresh smoke rose, no hoofbeats echoed back across the open ground. Folks went about their chores with stiff movements, pretending life carried on as usual, but every conversation circled back to the same question. Why did the sheriff need to chase a man who had not run? The broken lantern sat locked in his office, yet no one spoke of it now. Truth had a way of being tucked away when fear grew louder. She kept her curtains drawn while she ate a small breakfast of cornbread and berries. She told herself she would not get involved further, that last night had been enough. But her thoughts wandered back to the creek bed, the faint ashes, the quiet camp. She wondered if he knew the riders were coming, if he had passed too close to town again. The plains were wide, but danger traveled far when men carried doubts. By midday, she walked to the edge of town, claiming she needed to trade cloth at the mercantile. She passed the blacksmith who hammered a horseshoe harder than necessary, his eyes fixed on her as if she carried trouble in her shadow. Children played marbles near the well, but their laughter felt out of place in the tense air. She noticed how townsfolk spoke in hushed voices whenever she walked by. Word traveled fast. The people of Red Hollow did not forget easily. And they certainly did not forgive a woman who stood before men when silence would have kept peace. Inside the store, the atmosphere felt warmer. Mr. Hall, the owner, greeted her with his usual polite nod. He had been in town longer than most, a calm voice during droughts and winters. He asked if she was feeling all right after last night. He did not accuse her, only offered concern, which made her shoulders ease slightly. She said she was fine, though she did not feel fine at all. He leaned closer, keeping his voice low. He said he heard the riders planned to bring the Apache to the fort north of the valley once they found him. Not for trial, but for questioning. She asked why a fort was needed if no one had proof of wrongdoing. He said sometimes proof did not matter when soldiers wanted to keep peace with nearby settlers. He said the region had been tense for months, with traders losing cattle, crops raided by unknown hands, and ranchers pointing fingers across borders. Her chest tightened. She had heard rumors of raids too, but she never believed they were led by Apache warriors. Stories had twisted like wind-blown branches, changing shape with every retelling. She left the store with heavier thoughts. As she walked home, she saw two young men patching the barn ruins. They worked in silence, hammering new beams where charred wood lay. One paused long enough to glance at her and whisper to the other. She knew they wondered why she had defended a man they knew nothing about. She wished she could tell them that truth was not something earned by familiarity, that sometimes strangers carried more honesty than neighbors. But she kept her head down and walked on. Near her cabin, she noticed movement beyond the tree line. A rider appeared, though not from the direction the sheriff had gone. The horse moved slowly toward her with caution, hooves quiet in the grass. Her breath caught as she recognized him. The Apache. He had come back, though she did not know if he sought shelter or answers. He dismounted at a distance, leaving the space between them open as, if offering her a choice to walk away, she asked if he knew the sheriff was looking for him. He said he saw the riders at dawn from a ridge. He watched them take the wrong trail. He had not gone far after leaving town. He stayed to see if the fire would spread into something worse. His voice held a tired patience. He said this was not the first time he had been hunted for fires he did not start. She asked if he knew who might have caused it. He hesitated before answering that some men in the valley traded land rights with outside groups who wanted cattle routes cleared. Burning a barn could push settlers into blaming tribes and asking for soldiers to secure territory. The fire might be part of something bigger, something hidden. His explanation settled like cold water in her stomach. She had heard talk of land disputes before, whispered arguments behind saloon doors and half-finished deals made at poker tables. This town sat on soil people fought to own. What if the fire had nothing to do with tribal lands at all, but with men who wanted more claim to their own side of the valley? It would not be the first time settlers framed others to grab more ground. She told him people believed he stayed close for a reason. He said he stayed because he knew someone planned to turn truth against him, and he needed to see who would speak up. His gaze held a heavy calm, like someone carrying a burden too long. She asked what he planned to do now. He looked toward the northern hills and said he carried something the sheriff would want. Something taken long before the fire, something buried deeper than smoke and rumors, before she could ask what. He tensed, hearing something she could not. A moment later she heard it too. Horses approaching. Not from town, but from the west, coming through brush at a steady pace. He backed away, blending into shadow as if practiced. She stepped forward instinctively, blocking clear sight of him from whoever approached. Two men rode into view wearing ranch coats, not uniforms. They asked if she had seen a rider pass through. She kept her voice steady, saying she had not been near the creek since morning. They glanced past her, suspicion simmering, but they moved on without pressing. Only when their hoofbeats faded did he step back into view. She told him he could not stay here long. He nodded, agreeing without bitterness. He said he did not want to bring trouble to her porch. She asked where he would go now that riders were hunting him from both sides. He said he needed to find an old trail near the canyon, a place where evidence of past deals lay hidden. She did not understand his full meaning, but she sensed he knew more about the fire's cause than he revealed. As he mounted his horse again, she asked one last question. Why choose truth when silence could keep him safe? He paused, eyes fixed on the horizon. He said truth was not something he chose. It was something that chose him the moment he saw innocent blood spilled years before. Blood blamed on his people when it belonged to men carrying lanterns like the one found by the barn. He rode off again. Quiet and steady, disappearing into brush with the same ease he arrived, she watched until he faded. Then she returned inside, but her mind could not rest. She paced the floor, thinking about land disputes, broken lanterns, and a history of blame built into the soil. The townsfolk feared what they did not know. Yet the unknown was already closer than they realized. By nightfall, distant shouts echoed across the plains. The sheriff's riders had returned, dragging a man behind them who was not the Apache. He was a ranch hand from the Callahan herd, injured and bleeding, captured after trying to flee when questioned. People gathered around asking why he ran. He stammered something about being near the barn the night it burned, about someone paying him to move cattle lines closer to the Carter property. His words cracked under pressure, and the sheriff pushed him hard against the wall, demanding names. The man refused. Fear twisted through the crowd again, but its direction shifted. She watched from the shadows, heart pounding. If the ranch hand knew the truth, then the fire was no accident. Someone wanted blame tossed like kindling, and somewhere beyond the crowd, the Apache watched too, unseen. Waiting for his moment to strike at the heart of the lie, the night settled heavy, full of breathless heat despite the cool wind. Nothing was solved. Nothing was safe, but the first spark of the real conflict had finally caught flame. The captured ranch hand stayed locked inside the sheriff's office through the night. guarded by two men who took turns pacing the porch with rifles across their shoulders. The town pretended to rest, but no one truly did. Lanterns flickered behind drawn curtains, and every drifting breeze carried whispers of guilt, land deals, and unspoken secrets. The sheriff claimed he would question the ranch hand again once daylight came, but word spread that his temper had already broken down the man's resolve. Some folks believed the truth was close. Others feared it was only being shaped to fit whatever outcome the sheriff wanted. She watched everything from a distance, keeping herself hidden while the crowd gathered outside the office. She could not hear every word, but she caught enough to know the ranch hand still refused to name who paid him. Sweat clung to his face and his voice trembled, yet his silence held firm. That stubbornness alone made her uneasy. People rarely protected the guilty unless they feared something worse than punishment. As dawn broke, the sheriff signaled for the prisoner to be moved. He ordered 3 riders to take the man to the fort, saying soldiers could force the truth out faster. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to cheer or protest. Some wanted answers immediately. Others did not trust soldiers to find justice without spilling more blood. She stood near the stable fence, clutching the rough wood rail as the riders tied the ranch hand to a saddle. He looked defeated but not resigned. His eyes darted around as if searching for help that would not come. Suddenly he shouted that the fire was never meant to destroy the barn, only to drive cattle across disputed lines. He swore he did not light it himself, that he was ordered to leave a trail so another man could finish the job. The sheriff snapped at him to stay quiet, pulling on the reins to silence him. But the words had already landed. The crowd shifted. If he was telling the truth, then someone from town had orchestrated everything and hid the evidence before blame could settle. She stepped forward, unable to hold back. She asked who gave the order. The ranch hand opened his mouth, but before sound escaped, a gunshot cracked from somewhere across the square. The bullet struck the dirt within steps of the sheriff's boots. Everyone dropped to the ground. Horses reared and bolted. The ranch hand collapsed sideways, not from a wound but from shock, his face twisting with fear. When the dust settled, the shooter was nowhere to be seen. Tracks led into the canyon trail beyond the old mill. The sheriff immediately blamed the Apache, claiming he fired to silence the prisoner. She knew it was a lie. The Apache had no reason to stop the ranch hand from speaking. If anything, he needed the truth to rise. But her protest would only inflame the crowd. She kept her voice trapped behind her teeth and watched as tension grew sharp. Enough to cut the morning air, the sheriff ordered more men to ride the canyon trail. He said if they did not find the shooter, they would bring back the Apache by force. No one argued. Fear had wrapped itself so tightly around their reason that they could not separate truth from suspicion. When the riders thundered away, she found herself shaking. She returned home, but every step felt harder than the last. She boiled water for tea but could not bring herself to drink. She sat in silence, staring at the door as though expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Just before noon, someone knocked softly. She hesitated before opening the door, half expecting a deputy. Instead, the Apache stood on her porch, dust clinging to his shoulders and his horse tied to a tree beyond the road. His expression held no panic, only controlled urgency. He asked if the ranch hand spoke any names. She told him what happened. He nodded with a clenched jaw. He said the shot did not come from his hands, but from someone waiting near the canyon ridge. He tracked the dust trail at dawn and found boot prints that matched soldiers from the fort. Somehow the military had moved before the town even decided what to do. The fire scandal was becoming more than a local quarrel. She asked why soldiers would care about burning a barn. He said the land around Red Hollow sat on a trade route worth more than cattle. Men from the fort wanted control over the trail to escort goods west, claiming it would bring safety to settlers. But they needed reason to seize property without paying for it. Fires, raids, and manufactured fear could push townsfolk to beg for protection. She felt cold all over. The conflict was deeper than she imagined, stretching beyond one night of smoke. The Apache said he had evidence hidden near the canyon, proof that a deal had been made between a rancher, a soldier, and a trader from outside the valley. That evidence could free his people from blame and reveal who wanted the land. But someone was hunting him to keep it buried? He asked her to come with him, not because he needed help fighting, but because she had seen the truth first. If the town turned its back, someone would need to speak when evidence came to light. She hesitated. Leaving town meant stepping beyond safety, stepping into danger with no way to return quietly. Yet she felt the pull again, the one that had driven her to speak in front of everyone the night of the fire. She could not pretend she wanted a quiet life anymore. She packed only a shawl and a small leather pouch of bread. They set out along the narrow marsh road, moving on foot at first so tracks would not reveal where they went. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over cracked soil. Coyotes yelped somewhere in the distance. The horizon stretched wide. Filled with dust and wind that smelled of dry sage, they traveled until the ground turned rocky and steep. He led her through paths hidden between sandstone walls. She did not know how he remembered such routes, but he walked with certainty, every footstep placed with purpose. They reached a ledge overlooking the valley, where thorny brush grew between jagged stones. He pointed to a small hollow beneath an outcrop of rock where something metallic glinted in the light. She knelt and brushed aside the dirt. Inside lay a rolled sheet of canvas marked with army seals, a map line showing boundaries redrawn to push tribal territory south while expanding ranch land for military supply routes. Next to it lay a journal written in a soldier's hand, entries describing payments to men near Red Hollow, including a ranch hand assigned to move livestock under the cover of night. She stared at the documents, hands trembling. This was more than suspicion. This was proof. Before they could move, distant hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. She stiffened. The Apache pulled her back behind the rocks, eyes narrowed. She could hear men shouting orders, boots hitting stone, rifles being drawn. The sheriff was not alone. Soldiers traveled with him now, riding under orders. If they stayed hidden, they might escape. If they moved, they might be seen. The canyon walls turned sounds into tunnels of echo, making it hard to tell how close the riders were. The Apache whispered that they needed to reach a ridge beyond the far slope. If they could circle around, they could reach a neutral camp where evidence could be shared safely. But the path ahead narrowed into a single rocky climb. Exposed to anyone watching, she gripped the journal and map close to her chest as they began moving again. Crawling across stone while the sounds of pursuit grew louder, pebbles slipped beneath her boots. The wind carried voices closer. A rider shouted that tracks led up the ridge. Another yelled that if they found the Apache, they were to bring him back alive only if he cooperated. The sky darkened with gathering clouds. The first drop of rain hit sand with a soft thud. The storm could hide them or expose them. Halfway up the slope, her foot slipped, scattering gravel down the cliff. The noise echoed like thunder. Men below shouted. Rifles were cocked. Hoofs hammered closer. The Apache pulled her up quickly, shielding her with his body as he scanned for cover. There was none. The ridge leveled only a short distance ahead. If they reached it, they might cross into safer ground. But gunfire cracked behind them, bullets striking stone and sending shards flying. The Apache grabbed her arm, urging her to run. Her breath burned her chest as she pushed forward. Rain fell harder, turning dust to mud. They reached the ridge's crest, just as riders burst into view below. Raising rifles toward the rocks where they stood, the next step would decide everything. But the moment hung suspended, unresolved. The storm howling around them as truth and danger collided on the edge of the canyon. Rain poured down the canyon walls in fast. Heavy sheets, blurring the rifles aimed from below. The ridge felt narrow beneath their feet, mud slick under her boots. The Apache stood slightly ahead of her, shoulders squared, ready to shield her if bullets rose through the storm. For a long second, neither side moved. The wind howled as if the land itself held its breath. Then lightning split the sky, lighting the canyon in a hard flash of white. The riders below shielded their eyes, and in that brief moment, the Apache pulled her forward, guiding her along the ridge toward higher ground. Mud splashed beneath them as they ran. Bullets followed, but the storm turned the canyon into shifting fog, each shot hitting stone instead of flesh. The higher they climbed, the more the soldiers struggled to track them. The ridge wound sharply, giving them enough cover to press on until the sounds behind them began to fade. Hoofbeats grew dull, lost under the roar of rain. Only when they reached a sheltered cave beneath a sandstone arch did they finally stop to breathe. She leaned against the wall, chest rising hard, rainwater dripping down her hair. The Apache watched the storm's direction, not trusting silence too quickly. After a time, he said the riders would need to return to lower ground before the flash floods started. The canyon was known to swell fast, and no horse could survive a sudden surge. She nodded, not out of relief, but because she finally understood that nature itself had become their shield when the rain eased into a steady drizzle. They made their way across the ridge again, heading toward the neutral ground he had mentioned. The land beyond the canyon stretched into open plains bordered by scattered cottonwoods and dry riverbeds now filled with rushing water. They walked for miles until the moon rose faintly behind clouds, pale and quiet. At last, they reached a camp built in a circle of stones near a cluster of old pines. Lanterns glowed softly, and riders stood guard without raising weapons. These were people from nearby settlements and small tribal bands, who met away from town lines to trade and talk without watchful eyes. The Apache spoke with them quietly, handing over the journal and the marked map. She sat beside a small fire while they examined the papers, studying every line and signature. Their leader, an older man with silver hair and calm eyes, finally nodded. He said this was proof of deals made behind closed doors. Soldiers had been working with select ranchers to claim roots that did not belong to them, hoping to push tribal people south and force settlers to rely on military protection. The fire at Red Hollow was only one step in their plan. She listened, holding her hands close to the warmth. It hurt to think her town had been wrapped into a lie so large. The Apache sat beside her, silent but alert. When the discussion ended, the leader handed the documents back and said the truth must be shown not only to soldiers at the fort, but to the people of Red Hollow too. Evidence meant nothing if only carried in whispers before dawn. They headed back toward town accompanied by a small group from the neutral camp. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean. Mist hung low over the grass. Coyotes trotted along the edges of the plains, watching from a distance. The path home felt shorter, though tension carried every step. She could see the town long before they reached it. Smoke curled from chimneys. People stirred, unaware that anything had shifted in the night. The sheriff was already outside, talking with soldiers who returned half-soaked and frustrated. When he saw the Apache riding back unharmed, his jaw tensed. The small group behind them stopped short of the square, letting her and the Apache step forward alone. The sheriff demanded answers. She held out the journal and map without shaking. He grabbed them, flipping through pages roughly. His eyes narrowing with every line he read. The crowd gathered slowly, drawn by rising voices. Men stood with arms crossed, waiting for someone to speak. Women peeked from porches, children clinging to skirts. When the sheriff finally looked up, his face had changed. Anger still simmered, but doubt now pushed against it. He asked where the papers came from. She told him the truth plain and clear, describing how the fire had been set to move cattle lines. How soldiers planned to take land by forcing fear. How the ranch hand never meant to destroy anything. The sheriff turned to the crowd, holding the map high. The rancher who owned the burned barn stepped forward, demanding to know why he had been used. Others muttered, stunned by the realization that trouble had not come from tribes or strangers, but from people claiming to protect them. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, caught between orders and public anger. The neutral group stayed silent at the edge of town, ready if the truth needed witnesses. For a long while, no one spoke. Then an older woman from the general store stepped beside her and said she believed every word. Another man nodded, saying he saw riders near the barn that night who did not look like tribesmen. Slowly, voices joined her side, one after another. The sheriff finally exhaled, long and heavy. He looked at the Apache with tired eyes and said he had chased the wrong danger. Not because he wanted to, but because it had been easier. Hard truths often were, he ordered the ranch hand released. He sent word to the fort demanding an inquiry, and he promised the town they would decide their land future together, not in secrecy. The soldiers, uneasy under so many eyes, returned to the fort without protest. The crowd dispersed with heavy but hopeful steps. The sheriff approached her alone, saying she had done more for justice than anyone expected. She did not answer with pride. She only said truth does not grow in silence. When she turned to the Apache, he stood quietly watching the sky brighten. The storm clouds drifted apart, and morning light fell across the town as if washing it clean. He said he would ride north to tell his people what happened, not as a warning but as a chance for peace. She asked if he would return. He gave a slow nod, saying the land between them no longer felt divided. She walked him to the edge of town. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and new beginnings. Before he rode off, he paused and looked at her with steady warmth. He told her courage was not in standing tall, but in standing when the earth shook beneath you. She felt her heart tighten in a way that was not fear. He rode away, but this time he did not disappear into shadows. He rode openly beneath the rising sun. She watched him go, then returned to Red Hollow with quiet steps, feeling the town shift around her. People nodded instead of staring. Some thanked her. Life would not change overnight, but seeds had been planted. Truth had taken root where fire once burned, and from the ashes of that night something new rose. Not just justice or understanding, but a bond that crossed divisions drawn long before either of them took their first breath. A bond built on truth and choice, not fear. The land still held scars. But now it held hope too, and she carried that hope with her. Knowing the story that began with fire had led to something brighter than she ever expected.